All right. Good morning. We will kind of start off, or just dive right into material. Don't have a whole lot of housekeeping stuff to mention up top. So we should be able to finish module 3 today. We'll have that participation quiz that we'll take a look at here later on in class. I'll post that module 3 quiz as soon as I'm done. So the due date on that is a little bit further off. So just in case, once again, flexibility, that due date will be next Wednesday by the end of the day. So we'll have that exam coming up next Thursday. I'll talk a lot more about that next week, but it'll cover module 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll have module 3 today, module 4 next Monday and Tuesday, review on Wednesday, and then that exam will be open that Thursday. A little bit different for this exam because we have the July 4th, so it's not on a Friday, it'll be on that Thursday. Other than that, I don't think I have any housekeeping stuff to mention off the top, so unless there's any other questions here. All right, I still see people trickling in a little bit lower than the number that we usually have. One thing I did want to mention, I re-uploaded the slides. I just rearranged things a little bit, so it's a slightly different order. So if you had downloaded those prior to, I don't know, about 30, 45 minutes ago, I would re-download it. It's the same slides and they're just in a slightly different order. So if you have the old one, you can kind of skip ahead. But we left off finishing up talking about demand. So we'll kind of start with supply. I said I'll go through this relatively quickly compared to what we did with demand, because a lot of the same principles are going to apply. Okay. So also, let me make sure, did I hit? Yes, I'm recording. So just like with demand, we have quantity demanded and demand, and we have quantity supplied, and then the supply curve. So the quantity supplied, like quantity demand, will be the quantity that a producer, somebody selling a good, is willing and able to provide at a specific price. Okay. So, I forgot to change that. Thank you for saying something. That will be the module 5-6 quiz. I still have to edit it a little bit. I copied it over from my template, so now it should be gone. We won't have to worry about that until after the next exam. So thank you for saying something. So let's go back here with supply. So kind of the reverse of demand is if I'm selling something, the price is a good thing to me, right? So when I sell something, it's going to cost me a certain amount of money. There is a marginal cost to supplying a good. That means that I'm only willing to supply that as long as the marginal benefit is above that marginal cost. What is the marginal benefit when I sell something? That would be the price. So when the price is going up, producers or suppliers who are selling a good, they're willing to sell more units to the market. Right? So here, instead of kind of an inverse relationship, we have that for the law of supply, when the price is going up, quantity supplied is also going up. Okay. So we're going to have, just like with demand, a supply schedule, and that will kind of show us that if the price is 0, I don't want to sell anything, right? As that price goes up, I'm willing to supply more and more units to the market. So we're using that same kind of orange mocha frappuccinos or Starbucks example. They're going to want to sell more drinks if they can charge higher prices for those, right? Because the more I sell, I might have to hire another worker, I might have to get a larger storefront. So the only way that that makes sense is if I'm able to sell this good for a higher price, right? That marginal benefit, right, to the producer is the price. It was the exact opposite for consumers. There, the price was their marginal cost. Okay. So from this supply schedule, just like with demand, we can graph this out, right? Just start plotting these points. And what we'll see is, as the price goes up, so is the quantity supplied. This would represent our entire supply curve, right? The supply curve shows us that relationship between price and quantity supplied. The quantity supplied is the specific number that they would be willing to sell at that specific price. Okay? Supply is kind of the, not the sum of all those things, but kind of all of those put together. Okay. So just like with demand, if we have this supply curve, I'm going to have a supply equation. Okay. Now we kind of have looks the exact same as our demand equation when we write it out in general form. So remember, y equals mx plus b. That's kind of our typical math, how we would see it in a math course for an linear equation. Here, our intercept A is still going to be represent our intercept. B will still represent the slope. Our x and y axis, just like with demand, y is going to be the price. However, x is now quantity, but it's not quantity demanded, it is quantity supplied. Okay, so we've got quantity supplied, price, our slope, and our intercept. But with supply, both the intercept and I say it's positive, or B is always positive. A is likely generally going to always start out at 0. I mean, there's no sense I would supply something if the price is 0. However, it could be that the intercept is something positive that I won't even provide, or I won't sell the first unit until the price raises to $2, right? Think about it like a home, right? If the price of a home is $20,000, I'm not willing to put my house on the market, right? So we're going to likely have positive values for both the intercept here and the slope, because now that relationship between price and quantity supplied is positive, right? So even if it's a low, small number, it's still going to be a positive value. So if we go back to our example, what was our y-intercept? Well, in this one, it was a little bit easier. It was 0. And then how would I find the slope of this line? Well, once again, it's just the change in y over the change in x. Now, I can use any 2 points here to calculate that slope. So notice if I were to choose kind of these 2 points where the price is 1 and 2, there, what's my change in y? Price is going up by $1 divided by the change in x. Quantity supplied is changing by 3. It would be 1/3. I could also use these 2 points. What's price changing by? $1. Between 4 and 5, what's quantity supplied changing by? 3. So it doesn't matter what 2 points I choose in that supply curve, I'll still end up with the exact same value for the slope. So we've got our supply equation, right? We can also think of, just like where demand represented marginal benefits, that was the marginal benefits to the consumer, right? That was the price where they would first purchase the good. For suppliers, we're going to think about supply represents their willingness and ability to sell this good. So when we look at the price where they'll first sell that unit, it would have to be that price, that's exactly when the marginal benefit would be equal to their marginal costs. So the supply curve is not going to tell us the marginal benefits of producers. It's going to tell us what their marginal costs are. Okay. So we can kind of think about it here, right? What would be the marginal cost of the second, third, ninth orange mocha frappuccino for Starbucks? It's really just the price. So switch to the .com here. Let's think about why this is the case. So we've got quantity supplied, I've got price here, got my supply curve. Okay. So let's assume, right, that the price they can charge is $2, right? What $2, right? This would essentially become the marginal benefit to those producers, right? That's what they can sell the good for. So the only units where they're going to sell is if the cost to producing that unit, or we said supply represents marginal costs, they're only going to sell that unit if the marginal cost is less than or equal to the marginal benefit. So at that price of $2, let me see, let me make sure the numbers line up there. Oh, what did we have? I had in my example, at $2, it was 6. Okay. So at $2, right, every single unit here, the marginal cost must have been less than $2, otherwise I wouldn't have supplied it. And the only way I'm going to supply that 6th unit is if that price is as high as $2, right? I'd be willing to supply that 6th unit at $2. If the price is any lower, well, now the marginal benefit is below the marginal cost, and I might only sell 5. And if the price falls even lower, maybe now I only sell 3, etc. So this supply curve is going to represent our marginal cost. So just like when we had demand, so this would be something like, I'll just put some let's see if I can remember the numbers. I think it was like 6 minus 1/2 quantity demanded. We said we could think of the price as really telling us the marginal benefit of consumers, and then to find the marginal benefit of different units, we just start plugging in different values for quantity, right? So this was what we looked at last class. For supply, its price is a function of the quantity supplied. We can think of that price as really telling us the marginal cost for these different units. So if I want to know the marginal cost of the first unit, I plug in a 1, so that would be what? 0.33. If I want to know the marginal cost of the second unit, plug in a 2, that would be 0.66. Third unit, that would be 1, so on and so forth. Okay. I put a point here because I was writing quick. Sorry, 1. Any questions on that idea? Once again, this should look really similar to what we were doing with demand. It's just that demand represented the marginal benefits to consumers. Supply will represent the marginal costs to the producers. Okay. All right. So we could, instead of 1, 2, and 3, plug in 2, 3, and 9 into that equation, come up with those marginal cost values. Now, if we do that, we'll see the marginal cost of producing more and more is going up. I kind of already mentioned or alluded to why. Well, if I want to produce more of a good, I'm going to need more resources. I need to hire more workers. I need to rent a larger space to sell my product. I need to rent or kind of build a larger production facility. As I want to produce more and more, I'm going to have to spend more and more money. What was I kind of doing initially? I was hiring the worker who was the most effective. So maybe I want to sell these orange mocha frappuccinos. I go out and I find a barista who can make 9 of them an hour. Well, if I want to make more than 9, I have to hire a second worker. Well, the second worker, if I hire them, if they could make more than 9 an hour, why wouldn't I have hired them first? So the second worker is always going to be a little less effective. Now, paying that worker the same amount of money, maybe they can only produce 6 drinks an hour. So my cost per drink is going up. This is the idea of why we have kind of increasing marginal costs. I will first select these resources to produce my good that are the lowest cost, right, or the most efficient. And then if I want to keep producing more and more, I'm going to have to hire less and less efficient workers or put my money towards less and less efficient means of production. Okay. So just like with demand, I've got a bunch of different companies selling a good. I've got individual supply, right? If I want to know what market supply is, if the current price for an orange mocha frappuccino is $3, well, Starbucks might be making them, but so might also Big B or all these other coffee places. So here I came up with some fictional company, right? But Jitterbug, right? We've got these two companies. All I'm going to do to come up with market supply is I'll have the individual supply schedules or the individual supply curves of these two companies. At every price, I'm just going to add up at this price, how much was each company willing to supply? 3 and 2. So the total market supply would be 5. And then if the price goes up to $2, what would market supply be? Just add up how much each producer is supplying. Here it would be 10, so on and so forth. Okay. So it's just like what we were doing for demand. To get market supply, we would add up every individual supply curve. Okay. So we've got market supply now, should always be increasing. It tells us that relationship between price and the quantity supplied. So just like with demand, we said the slope there represented how much the price would have to fall in order for a consumer to buy one more unit of the good. So with market supply, what is the slope here going to represent? It's how much the price would have to increase for us to provide one more unit of that good or produce one more unit and try to sell it on the market. Okay. So I think supply gets a little bit tricky only because most of us are consumers. So it's easier to think about things from a consumer standpoint. Now we're thinking about selling it or everything. We're thinking about selling this product, right? So now the price is actually a good thing. Okay. Any questions on that before we dive into the factors that will cause shifts in this market supply curve? All right. So just like with demand, right? We are assuming everything else is staying constant when we're analyzing the relationship between price and quantity supplied using this supply curve. All those other things being held constant, Well, we know those things can change, right? So even though we know the relationship that exists between price and quantity supplied, that same relationship exists, but if one of these other things changes, maybe we have the same slope to our supply curve, but it's going to be shifted to the left or the right, right? It's going to be higher or lower. So all these other things can change. What are these other things going to be? Now, excuse me, I'll talk through this and kind of give you some visuals in a second. But here is also where I think supply can be a little tricky, because an increase in supply, just like with demand, an increase in supply will be a shift to the right. So this is why I don't like to use the words up and down when we reference shifts, because a shift to the right in supply actually looks like a downward shift. Um, and then a supply decrease or a shift to the left, just like a decrease for demand, actually looks like an upward shift. So it kind of can get confusing. So here's where I've got them drawn out, but I'm going to do this for you. And I think hopefully show you something that'll cause you not to make this mistake of thinking about this as upward or downward shifts. So let's say I've got my initial supply curve, right? And I can think about this as it represents my marginal costs, okay? If I see an increase in supply, what that means is at every single price, so something else has changed. So the one that I'll use to kind of set up this idea with the very first thing that we were holding constant that could change, which is, I said that here, if I've got, oh, sorry, I started drawing this out for demand. So we'll do this again. All right, so we've got my quantity supplied, I've got my initial supply curve. And the one thing I want to show you is, if I'm looking at quantity supplied and price, maybe I have two individual supply curves. How would I get my market supply curve? Well, at every single price, I would take the quantity supplied from both firms and add them up. At every single price, I would take the quantity from both firms, add them up. So my market supply is going to look something like this. And I'll call this kind of our first market supply. Right? If I have more individuals in this market, so let's say instead of two producers, I now have, and it could even be here, I've got a third producer and a fourth producer. Well, now at every single price, how do I get market supply? I'm not only adding up the supply from two, I'm adding up from all four, or here, all four. So my market supply is going to be at an even higher quantity supply. So when I have more individuals in my market, we said for consumers that would increase demand. Same thing here. When I have more suppliers of a good, I'm going to have more supply curves to add up. So my market supply is going to be higher. Now you'll notice this is a rightward shift, right? But it also looks like it's kind of shifting down, right? So this is why we don't want to think about this as upward or downward. We're thinking about it as moving to the left and the right. So what does this really mean when I see a supply increase? So if I have a supply increase, the way I like to describe it, so let's say this is my second supply curve representing a supply increase. What am I doing? I'm moving further away from this 0 point. That's the way to think about these supply increases and decreases. It's also the correct way really to think about demand increases and decreases. If my curve is shifting away from this 0 point, it's increasing. If my curve was shifting to the left, right? Well, there I'm getting closer to that 0 point. So supply decreases, they look like it's shifting up, but it's not shifting up, it's shifting towards that point of zero quantity supply. Okay. So increases in supply. This was decreases in supply. All right. Any questions on that idea? This might, like I said, that might just be a way to kind of not get confused thinking about this as like up and down. Think about it as moving towards or away from that point where nothing is supplied. Okay. So I've got supply decreases, supply increases. Okay. I'll skip this for a second because this is the one that we've already talked about. So we already talked through this one. This was just the idea. If I have more sellers of a good, I'm going to have more individual supply curves that add up. So my market supply is going to increase. Now, the two that I skipped through are also related to each other. So let's think about this first one. Let's say I've got input prices going up, right? If input prices are increasing, okay, that means that to produce the same number of units, my costs are now higher. Okay? Just intuitively, if it's going to cost me more than it did before to produce something, so let's say all of a sudden I have to pay my workers more money because of a minimum wage. Well, if my costs are going up, if the price stays the same, remember the price is the marginal benefit to these sellers. Well, now it's more likely marginal cost is above marginal benefit, and I won't supply that to the market. So if it costs me more money to make something, inherently, just intuitively, I think we're going to supply less. I'm less likely to even produce that good at all. So when input prices go up, we see that supply decreases. And then if it becomes cheaper to produce something, we're going to see supply increases. So examples of this, if sugar prices all of a sudden go up, we see a decrease in the supply of candy, right? Some of the raw materials used to make this product, if they're more expensive, I'm less likely to produce as much as I was before. If milk goes up, if the cost of milk goes down, well, now it's cheaper for me to make these orange mocha frappuccinos. I might be willing to supply more to the market. Okay. And then I already used this example, but right, if any company that uses minimum wage workers, if the minimum wage goes up, their workers are now more expensive. It costs them more to pay them to make the product. Their costs go up, they're going to decrease their supply of that good. Okay. Almost one-to-one with input prices. What are some things that could change how much it costs me to produce something? Well, how efficient are my workers, or how efficient is my machinery? So another thing, and I'll come back to this in a second, would be advancements in technology. So all an advancement in technology is it means I can produce the same units, but now at a lower cost per unit. So an advancement in technology is just a decrease in marginal costs, right? So we love technology because what does it do? It lowers our input prices. If we lower input prices, we're going to be able to, or be willing to supply more to the market. So another way of thinking about these input prices or technology changes that impact these input prices is that at every quantity, right, my cost is now lower. So let's say I've got lower input prices, or I have a technology change that lowers those input prices. That means to produce the same number of units, whatever my marginal cost was before, which is represented by our supply curve. So before that 10th unit, the marginal cost to produce it was $2. Well, I know after my input prices go down, that cost must be lower. So that same unit, I'd be willing to supply it at a lower price. That's going to be true. I have the arrows going across here, but you can think of it vertically as well. So one way of thinking about it is at every price, I'm willing to supply more. Or you can think about it as at every quantity, I would now be willing to supply that same quantity at a lower price, right? Either way you think about that, it's still going to look like this rightward or kind of downward shift in supply. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Again, I'll try to move through this a little quicker to save us some time. So we've already done number of sellers. We can also do price expectations. Okay. So this is where it's going to work the exact opposite of demand, right? So here I kind of have this as a catch-all category, but market expectations. So this would be something like, if I expect it's going to be unseasonably cold winter and I'm a natural gas supplier, I think that I might want to save, right? I might not want to sell that product now because I think in the future people are going to be more likely to pay more for it, or I think that the price might be higher. So if the price is going to be higher in the future, what would I want to do today? Maybe stockpile that, not sell it today, and try to hold off and sell it a couple, this winter. So market expectations that will impact prices could shift supply. So we're going to focus more on, because these market expectations are going to be different for every single good we're looking at. So I'm not going to expect you to be an expert in, every single type of good. But what I will expect you to know is how price expectations will impact supply. So we said, if I think that there's going to be higher prices in the future, well, for a seller of a good, the price is a good thing. So if I think the price might be higher tomorrow, let's say I think the price of gas is going to go up tomorrow. If I'm a gas station, maybe I try to not sell it today. I want to make sure that I'm selling it tomorrow. So my current supply would actually go down. And then if I think prices are going to be lower in the future, well, then I really want to make sure I sell it today. So I'd be willing to supply more today if I think prices are going to be lower in the future. So this was the exact opposite relationship that we had for consumers, because the price for consumers is a bad thing. Price for producers or sellers is a good thing. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. What about the price of related goods? So I guess I have my animations turned off on these arrows, but just like with demand, we have substitutes and complements in production. So if I have substitutes in production, right, what's going to happen? So in general, if the price of good Y increases, if it's a substitute in production, the supply of good X goes down. So I'll kind of give you some examples of these, and we'll kind of return to the shorthand in a second. So let's say I've got, I've got some factory set up, and I can produce two things. So I'll do kind of an easy one. I can do wooden tables or kind of chairs, right? If all of a sudden, for some weird reason, people are willing, right, to pay a lot more for tables, right? There's a higher equilibrium price, and we'll talk about equilibrium prices later. The price that I can charge for a table all of a sudden goes up. Well, if I can switch my production facility over to produce any wooden good, instead of producing chairs, I'm going to be more likely to want to produce tables now. Because if I'm the seller of a good, a higher price is a good thing. So what's going to happen to the supply of chairs if the price of tables goes up? I'm going to be more likely to switch my production to tables, supply fewer chairs. So substitutes in production, there's kind of this inverse relationship. Okay. So kind of a weird example once again, but you can also have not just substitutes in production. So this was thinking about kind of our substitutes. We can also have complements in production. Now, there aren't as many great examples of this. The one I always use, and it's kind of dumb, but it's just something that, the production process lends itself well to this example. Let's say all of a sudden I'm making, say, these tables. So I'm thinking about what happens to the supply of tables here. Well, when I'm making these, if I'm making them out of wood, inherently in this production process, I'm getting sawdust. So let's say all of a sudden, I don't know, something comes out that sawdust is a great thing to keep deer away from your plants or something. And all of a sudden, people are much more likely to pay much higher prices for bags of sawdust. Well, if by making tables, I inherently am getting sawdust at the same time, and I can now sell that byproduct for a higher amount of money, am I going to want to be more likely to produce these tables if I'm getting this good that I can now sell for a higher price? I'm going to be more likely to produce that complement in production. So with complements in production, we have these working, the price and the supply of the good working in the same direction. Okay. Any questions on that idea? I think, let's see, I've got kind of the general form here. I had another one, which is I could choose corn or soybeans. So if I'm thinking about planting a field, if there's substitutes, I can only plant one crop in my field. If the price of corn goes down, well, then I'm less likely to want to produce corn. I'm more likely to want to produce the other good, which is soybeans. So I would see an increase in the supply of soybeans. If I had complements, so another example of this, I went on a tour of some distillery, and I wasn't really aware of this, but during the pandemic, when you're producing like spirits, like whiskey, vodka, these things, there's like they pull some of just the pure alcohol out during the production process, and they used to like not know what to do with it. All right. So during the pandemic, they realized, oh, all of this like just pure alcohol we're pulling out, it basically very easily, it's almost already hand sanitizer. So during the pandemic, when hand sanitizer, people were willing to pay a lot more for it. what did these distilleries actually do? They increased their production of whiskey, vodka, and these spirits because they were getting this byproduct that could now be sold for a higher price. So the complement in its production, they were also increasing the supply of. All right. And then this one, kind of similar to demand. We have taxes and subsidies. I'm just kind of introducing this now because for modules 5 and 6, we'll kind of revisit this. But if I tax instead of consumers, if I put a tax on the production of something, so this is, you think of like really tariffs are basically a good example of this. In order now to produce my product, some of the raw materials I was using from overseas are now more expensive, right? Those taxes are essentially what? An input price. They're increasing my input prices. So we said if input prices are going up, it's more costly for me to make something. Do I want to supply more or less? Less of it. So we have taxes, decreased supply. It's basically the same thing as input prices. It raises the marginal cost at every quantity. And then, so I think I did, if I have to pay these, there's another common one. If there's taxes on carbon emissions, right, when I'm producing something like gasoline, well, if all of a sudden now to produce the same amount of gasoline, I now also have to have this additional cost, which is I pay this carbon tax. What happens to the supply of gasoline? It would actually go down, right? And then subsidies, if I give companies money to do something, it's essentially lowering their cost. So if I'm lowering their costs or input prices, what's happening to supply? It's going to increase. So this is great examples of this would be like any agricultural product where they're given subsidies, right? We're going to see that, maybe before, if I had a field. So I knew some farmers that did this when I was growing up in an area where it had some land that was not there were certain years where they knew, I don't understand all the ins and outs of agriculture, but they knew that the crop was going to be bad because of the way that the land, the soil cycles. So before they used to like give it a year off. They wouldn't plant anything. Well, when the government started giving subsidies for some of these different products, what they would do is they would plant these products knowing, well, we're not really going to get anything out of this field, right? Well, we weren't going to get anything if we planted it anyways, but now we'll get this additional subsidy. And if the subsidy is high enough, it makes it valuable to just plant it and basically just call it, I know that my product's going to be worthless, but I'm getting now this additional marginal benefit from these subsidies. So anytime we give subsidies for the production of something, people are going to be more likely to supply it. Okay. All these car companies, right? Why do every car company is now starting to come out with their own electric vehicle? Well, there's huge subsidies for the production, then it makes it more likely they want to supply those to the market. Okay. So here's our kind of summary of all those things. Just like we had for demand, we've got all those things for supply as well. Okay. Any questions on anything we talked about with supply before we keep moving here? Okay. So we'll set this up thinking about the combination now. We're set up to think about the combination now of market supply, market demand. Once we understand these, we can also determine, okay, well, those have a bunch of different prices. What does the price of the good end up being? That's what we call our equilibrium. Why is the price of a new car $40,000? Or why is the price of a gallon of gas $3.30? Well, it has something to do with the marginal costs to the producers in that market and the marginal benefits to the consumers. Right? So how is the price of a good determined? Also, how is the equilibrium quantity of units, both produced and consumed, determined? So we'll call this our equilibrium price and quantity. When we look out on the market and we see that the current price of gas is $3.30 and X number of gallons are being sold, that's our equilibrium price and quantity. What ends up being true is that equilibrium is going to be the point where our market supply and our market demand curves intersect. Okay? So our equilibrium price is going to be where supply and demand intersect. What that means is we're at the same quantity on both of those curves, which means the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded at that point. Well, if we're at the same quantity supplied, quantity demanded at that price, where that's true, that will also represent our equilibrium quantity. Okay. So visually, what does this look like? And then we'll kind of think about what if a market isn't in equilibrium. But if I had a market supply, market demand curve here, and I think these were, I tried to get the numbers to match up to the market supply and demand we had for the orange mocha frappuccino example. Well, where does demand equal supply? It's going to be right here at a price of $3. At that price, both the market supply, quantity supplied, and the market quantity demanded was exactly 15. So 15 here would be our equilibrium quantity. Okay. If I, instead of looking at this just visually on a graph, I could have the graph to look at, but if I just had the supply and demand schedules, well, I can see here when the price is 0, 24 people want to buy this good, nobody wants to sell it. If the price goes up to $1, 21 people want to buy it, but there's only 5 people willing to produce it on the market. So here there's a lot of people who want to buy the good, but there's nobody willing to, there aren't enough units out there on the market for all of them to get one. Until we get to this price of 3, now the number of people who want to buy this good, that exact same number of units is what is being supplied. We would kind of say that's where our equilibrium is. Price of 3 would be our equilibrium price, and the corresponding equilibrium quantity would be 15. Okay. Is this hopefully? So I'll show you another way. I think I've got shortages and surpluses here, but I'll give you another reason or kind of glimpse into why that equilibrium price and quantity is going to be what it is. Okay. So when we're looking at our market supply curve and our market demand curve, okay, what did we say demand represented to the consumers? It was their marginal benefit for all these different quantities. Supply represented the producer's marginal costs. So think about here, if I was looking at this unit, if this were the current price, right, the marginal benefit, right, this person is willing to pay the marginal cost, sorry, for the consumer, the price is the marginal cost, right? So as long as their marginal benefit is greater than or equal to that price, the marginal cost, they're willing to buy that. So really, any price below this, the consumer is willing to buy whatever quantity we're looking at here, just to put a number to it. Now, at that same quantity, what's the marginal cost to the producer? Well, they're willing to produce or sell that unit if the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Well, what represents the marginal benefit to the producer? That was the price. So as long as for the producer, the price is anywhere in this range, we could come to an agreement for that third unit where the consumer would be willing to pay any price in this range and the seller would be willing to sell it for any price in that range. Okay. Now that's going to be true at every point as long as the marginal benefits in the market are above or equal to those marginal costs. So the point where they would be exactly equal to each other, where supply is equal to demand. That's why this ends up being our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price. Because for every unit here, if this is the price, notice, well, for every unit sold, the consumer is making, kind of having net benefits that are positive, right? Their marginal benefit is above their marginal cost. And for every unit in this range at this equilibrium price, every producer, the marginal benefit or the price to them is above their marginal cost for all those units. The reason why it stops there is because what would the price have to be for the producer here? Somewhere above their marginal cost. And for the consumer, what would the price have to be? Somewhere below their marginal benefit. There's no overlap there. There's no range, right? There's no price where they could come to an agreement on, right? There's no overlap, right? There's a separation in between those two. Okay. So we kind of stop right where those market marginal benefits represented by the demand curve are exactly equal to the market's marginal costs, equal to that supply curve. Okay. So just another way of thinking about why that equilibrium is going to be what it is. Okay. Any other questions on that before we kind of switch gears here a little bit? Okay. All right. Let me think what I want to do given time. We'll come back to this. I thought we'd have enough time, and that's why I moved it. And of course, I always kind of over-explain, I think, on some of these things. So we're going to skip ahead, and we'll revisit this at the end of class if we have time as well. We won't have time to revisit this, but we'll revisit this at the end of class. So what I want to make sure we have time to talk about today. So now that we know where this equilibrium is, why do we see the prices of goods change, right? Well, that's because even though we have our market supply, market demand, all these other things that we were holding constant can change and shift those curves. Well, if those curves shift, the new point where supply is equal to demand is going to be different. Okay. So let's think about how we're going to determine where our new equilibrium price and quantity will be after we have one of these things change and shift supply or demand. So the very first thing we'll do is figure out this thing that happened. Is it going to shift my supply curve, my demand curve, or what we'll eventually talk about is both? Not only which curve or curves does it shift, but which direction? Do they increase or decrease? And then draw our diagram to determine, will that shift increase or decrease our equilibrium quantity and price? Okay. So the very first thing we'll kind of think through is how demand shifts will impact our equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So if I've got a market and here's my initial demand curve and here's my initial supply curve, we said that equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity will be where supply is equal to demand. Okay. So let's say I've got, I don't know, a change in, what's a good I could use here? We'll just do something kind of easy. So let's do, I don't know, hamburgers. And I'm thinking about, these are substitutes in consumption for hot dogs. Well, let's say the price of hamburgers goes up. Okay. What's going to happen to my demand curve for hot dogs? Well, if these are substitute goods, when the price of the other good goes up, what happens to the demand for this good? People are less likely to buy hamburgers, more likely to buy hot dogs. So we're going to see an increase in demand. So we said an increase in demand means that at every price, the quantity demanded is higher, or we kind of have this rightward shift, movement away from that quantity demanded of 0. So where is my new equilibrium and price and quantity going to be? It's where my new supply curve is equal to my new demand curve. Right? So we can kind of see here, demand increases are going to cause both my equilibrium price and my equilibrium quantity to also increase. Right? So demand, I have it written in shorthand, but just to kind of help. Demand increases, and this was from a change in the price of a substitute good, are going to cause both the equilibrium price and quantity to go up. Okay. Now, I'm going to put this all on the same graph for the sake of time. But let's say I had it instead of this change. Let's say I've got an income increase. Okay. And I believe, or I'm told, hot dogs, right, are an inferior good. So if people have more money for an inferior good, the demand is actually going to decrease. And actually this green, I don't know if it's showing up as green to you. So I'm going to change to blue so it's maybe a little bit easier to see. So what does this demand decrease do? Well, if I initially was at this demand curve, a decrease in demand means that every point the quantity demanded is lower. So here, a demand decrease is going to look like a leftward shift. Where does my supply and demand curve intersect now? Well, now that's going to cause my equilibrium quantity and price to both fall. Okay. So demand increases will increase both the price and quantity, equilibrium price and quantity. Demand decreases will decrease both the equilibrium price and quantity. So this is where we'll start to get through problems. Anytime you have a question about like the equilibrium changes, you should always be drawing something out to help you kind of see this, right? I mean, you can remember or memorize all this like shorthand stuff, but I think the easiest way to not make mistakes is drawing out visually what this is going to look like. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay, just making sure there's nothing in the chat. So what if instead we have a scenario where I'm looking at, here's my initial supply curve, here's my demand curve, where does supply equal demand? Here's my initial equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So now we'll start out thinking about, okay, what if there's we could do electric vehicles, right? So what if all of a sudden there is a subsidy given to the producers, right? We said subsidies given to producers are going to do what to our supply? Well, if you're giving companies money to do something, essentially you're lowering their overall like net costs, if you want to think about it that way. So, or if I'm given money to do something, what am I going to do? More of it. So if I give companies money to produce electric vehicles through the, however I do this, whether it's a subsidy or tax credits, whatever it is, I'm going to see an increase in my overall supply curve. Remember, it's a rightward shift. It's moving away from that 0 point. So where is my new equilibrium price and quantity? Where supply is equal to demand. So what has happened from a supply increase? Well, there it actually drives that equilibrium price down and the equilibrium quantity up. So unlike demand, supply increases will have different impacts on the equilibrium price and quantity. With demand, we said that pushed both of them in the same direction. Okay. All right, any questions there? So what if I have, what's one we haven't done? Let's do, let's say all of a sudden, I want to decrease. So let's say people can either buy electric vehicles, yeah, people can either buy electric vehicles or gas-powered vehicles. Let's say the price of gas-powered vehicles, for whatever reason, falls. Right? Well, if I have my production process and I can produce gas-powered or electric-powered vehicles, or sorry, I don't want this. We got to do an opposite one. I want the price of gas-powered vehicles to go up, okay? If the price of gas-powered vehicles goes up and I have my production process set up to be able to produce either gas or electric vehicles, what am I more likely to want to sell? The thing that has a higher price. So what's going to happen to my supply of electric vehicles? It's actually going to go down, right? So the supply decrease means at every price, I'm willing to supply less than I was before, or we have this supply curve moving closer to that 0 point. So that supply decrease, what impacts is that going to have on my equilibrium price and my equilibrium quantity? It's going to push my price up, right? But that equilibrium quantity down. Okay. Any questions? I get this all on the screen here. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So when you just have a single shift I think it's kind of easy to kind of draw this out. Now I'm putting multiple shifts on the same graph. You will only ever have like just a supply decrease, just a supply increase, just a demand increase, or just a demand decrease. Okay. Excuse me. All right. Any questions there? I kind of left those open. Now I put them on different graphs here as kind of like these summary slides. So here you've got a demand increase, supply increase. Now notice rightward shifts. Increases are always rightward shifts, no matter what curve we're talking about. Decreases are leftward shifts, no matter what curve we're talking about. And then we can kind of identify these equilibrium changes. Okay. These aren't maybe as, they don't have as many points identified in these graphs, but this is just kind of a summary. Okay. So with that in mind, before we go to the next thing, let's take a look at today's the 27th. So we'll look at today's module quiz or module participation quiz. So I think I've got a couple other examples here, and looks like I don't know, have similar examples in my head. I didn't quite catch the sensors. Turn the lights on. Okay. So if I've got gasoline powered vehicles and all of a sudden the government taxes the production of those vehicles. So anytime we see this word production, who should we automatically be thinking about? Suppliers, producers. We should be thinking about there's a shift in our supply curve. So if there's a tax, right? So I had an example earlier where we had like a subsidy. That was a benefit. We saw an increase in supply. If I tax producers, I'm essentially just increasing their input prices or their input costs. And so there, if it's more costly to make these vehicles, I'm going to want to supply less of them. What does a supply decrease look like? A movement of this supply curve towards that 0 point, right? Towards the origin. So here we know that we're going to have a change in supply. We said it was a decrease. So it's going to look like this, which, a little bit more in depth of a question. So D represents our supply decrease here. But what's happening to the equilibrium price and quantity? The equilibrium price is going up, and my equilibrium quantity is going down. So when you have just a supply shift, your equilibrium price and quantity should be doing different things, right? One of them should be going up, one of them should be going down. If it's supply decrease, price is going up, quantity is going down. Okay. What if instead we had the price of, this is the exact same one I did, except for I did it in the opposite direction. So let's say I have a substitute in production for an electric powered vehicle, and the price decreases. Well, if I'm producing either electric or gas powered vehicles, and now gas powered vehicles, the price is lower, I don't want to be producing those because I can't sell them for as much money. I want to be more likely to produce these electric vehicles. Supply should increase. What did our supply increase look like? A rightward shift, a movement away from this 0 point. That's going to lower my equilibrium price, but increase my equilibrium quantity, right? So that's going to be kind of the depiction there for that supply increase. And then one more. What if instead I have subsidies not to producers, right, but to consumers? And so my wife has a Jeep and it's like hybrid, and we got some tax write-off as essentially a subsidy for having that vehicle. So if I'm going to be given a certain amount of money for buying this good, am I going to want to buy more or less of it? Now, in the context of a vehicle, going from 0 to 1 would be buying more, or 1 to 0 is probably buying less. But if you subsidize these electric vehicles, it's going to be more likely you're increasing the marginal benefit or you're increasing the demand curve. Right? So we should see a increase in our demand curve, which is a movement away from this 0 point, or demand is shifting to the right. Now, a follow-up question could be, how does that change my equilibrium price and quantity? It's pushing my equilibrium price up and my equilibrium quantity up as well. Right? So there, A would be kind of the depiction of this scenario. Okay. So once again, anytime you have these changes, you should be able to draw these graphs out for yourself. Okay. And hopefully that should be right? Everything we want, right? So those are the three kind of participation questions for the day. If there aren't any other questions on those, we'll kind of return to the slides here. So let me make sure. Wait, hold on. Was I sharing my screen during that? Now I'm seeing in the chat. Okay, we couldn't see your screen. Okay, hold on. So I talked through all these. I just wasted a bunch of time, but it's okay. So that first one, I've kind of already talked through the reasoning here. Hopefully, it's still locked. Why is it locked? I thought I hit it. Oh. So 627 shouldn't be locked. Can everyone else verify? Are you able to get into the quiz?
It still says that it's locked.
Well, it's published. Let's see. Oh, because why is this set to 12:30? Apologize for that. Now we should be able to access it. Anyone verify with me now?
Yeah, it's open now.
Okay, so we'll go through that again. I talked through all these, so hopefully the kind of reasoning, I won't kind of rehash it as much, but to kind of show you what I was pointing to. And once again, I'm never doing something and you're like, what the hell is he? I can't see this. Speak up. Please feel free to kind of unmute your mic and let me know. So the first question, we had these taxes on producers. So we said, we're going to see that if I increase the cost of producers, their supply is going to decrease. That pushed the equilibrium price up, equilibrium quantity down. If I had the price of gas-powered vehicles going down and I can produce either gas or electric vehicles, well, I'm less likely wanting to produce these gas vehicles now because I can't sell them for as much. But so I switch my production over to electric vehicles. That means the supply of electric vehicles actually increases or moves away from this 0 point. So that would drive the equilibrium price down, but the equilibrium quantity up. And then that last one, now if I'm thinking about consumers, if I subsidize the consumption, I give people money for consuming a certain good, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to want to buy more of it. So we had this demand increase or this rightward shift, pushing that equilibrium price and quantity up. Right? So there, kind of our depiction that showed that was A. Okay. All right. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So we've got what, 17 minutes left here. What do I want to do? Simultaneous changes. So my mouse. There we go. Well, I think this will be. Let's go through a simultaneous shift one. So if we have a little extra time, I'll touch on shortages and surpluses. If we don't, we'll wrap up module 3. And any quiz question I have related to that, you might get a freebie on the shortage surplus stuff. So, well, yeah. So let's think about what if I have multiple changes at the same time. Okay. So if I have both a shift in supply and demand, well, it depends on which way they shift, but sometimes they push the equilibrium quantity and price in opposite directions. So it's not going to be as easy to determine what happens to my new equilibrium price and quantity when we have these simultaneous shifts. Okay. So I'll work through an example and kind of show you how you would work out a simultaneous shift example. So let's say I've got the market for asphalt. I don't know why I chose this example. I probably saw road construction crews working and I thought, okay, if all of a sudden the price of oil, because of what's going on in the Middle East, goes up, I've got a huge increase in the price of oil. That's a main input into the production of asphalt. Well, at the same time, if I see an increase in the price of gravel, well, when people are putting in a driveway or kind of wanting a surface to be able to park on, they're choosing maybe between asphalt and gravel. So this is like a substitute in consumption. Okay. So I've got a change in the price of a substitute in consumption. and a change in the price of a major input, or essentially an increase in my input prices. So if input prices go up, what's going to happen to supply? If it's more costly to make something, I'm going to supply less of it. If I see an increase in the price of gravel, a substitute in consumption, well, now if I'm putting in a driveway, I'm less likely to want to put in a gravel driveway, more likely to have an asphalt driveway. I should see an increase in demand. So how is this going to impact our equilibrium? Oh, I'll get rid of these comments here in the report. So what you should do when you have these simultaneous changes is not put them on the same graph. So I'll show you how I would work it out, and then I'll show you if you try to put them on the graph at the same time, why it's going to result in potentially to you making mistakes. Okay. So let's think initially, I've got my supply and demand curve for asphalt. Here's my equilibrium price. Here's my initial equilibrium quantity. We said when the price of oil goes up, that was an input into producing asphalt. And so that led to, if it's more costly to make it, we're going to see that supply decreased. Okay. So a decrease in supply was a leftward shift, right? Moving closer to this 0 point. So the first thing that you would do is look at that very first shift, the supply shift, and determine what impacts would that shift have on my equilibrium price and quantity. So my new point where supply is equal to demand is going to be at a higher price and a lower quantity. So if I were doing this, I would say, okay, look, I had this supply decrease. It caused my equilibrium price to go up and my equilibrium quantity to go down. Okay. Now, the next thing that changed was we had the price of gravel going up, which was a substitute in consumption. We said that would increase the demand for asphalt. So I'm then going to draw, okay, here was my initial equilibrium price and quantity for asphalt. This increase in demand, what is that going to look like? Well, that means that every price, quantity demanded is higher, or I have this rightward shift in my demand curve. What impacts did that demand increase have on my equilibrium price and quantity? Well, the new point where supply is equal to demand is out here. So my equilibrium price and quantity from just that change in demand, it caused both of them to increase. Okay. So when these things happen at the same time, right, I could think about here. I didn't save myself quite enough room, but what would my total effect be? Okay. Well, for price, both these changes are causing the equilibrium price to go up, so I automatically know that equilibrium price is going to increase. However, what about my equilibrium quantity? Well, each change is pushing it in the opposite directions. So there, that's supposed to be, sorry, a question mark, right? I don't know, okay? I can't tell you, unless you tell me the size of the shifts, I can't tell you what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity, right? Because they're pushing it in opposite directions. So sometimes when we have these simultaneous changes, we can say what's going to happen to one of these, the equilibrium price, but we don't know about the equilibrium quantity. And then there's there's 4 different combinations, or I could have both of them increase, both decrease, supply decrease, demand increase, demand decrease, supply increase. So all those different combinations, you would solve them the same way. Draw out each shift, determine what impacts each shift is having on price and quantity, and then look and say, okay, if they're both pushing price or quantity in the same direction, I know what's going to happen to the new equilibrium. If they push them in opposite directions, there we would say it's indeterminate. I need more information. I don't know what's going to happen to that equilibrium unless I know the size of these shifts. And that's not something I'll kind of expect you to know at the end of this module. We'll stop at it's indeterminate. Okay? The kind of next level would be to like analyze the size of shifts to know which one is larger than the other. Okay? Any questions on that before we keep moving here. I'm going to draw something else out for you. And I've got it all kind of written out here. I have the shorthand that I just worked through. And here, that's where we said it's indeterminate. We don't know. I've got, so that's what I left open. You've got different combinations, right? So we just did a what? Demand increase and supply decrease. You could have these other four combinations as well. And so there, something is, always going to be indeterminate, right? So when you have a demand and supply increase, you know that quantity is going to be going up, but we don't know where the new equilibrium price is. If they both decrease, we know quantity is going to be going down. We don't know where the new equilibrium price is. And then these other combinations here, I know that the price is going to go up. I don't know about quantity. This combination of changes, I know that price is going to go down, but I don't know where the new quantity will be. Okay. All right. So I'll show you why you don't want to draw these on the same graph. So let's say I put my demand increase up here as well. Notice, before I do that, are there any questions before I start to alter these graphs? Or did everyone have these kind of written down that wanted to? Okay. So notice, let's say instead I put like a really small demand increase. What would happen to my equilibrium price and quantity? Well, my new supply curve is here. My new demand curve is right here. It looks like, compared to where I started, that the quantity went down and the price went up. What if instead I had drawn in a really large demand increase? Well, now the new point where my supply curve hits demand is going to be out here. So now it looks like still that my price went up, but now when that demand shift was larger, it looks like my equilibrium quantity is now higher. So this is why the size of the changes matters, right? So I don't really know what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity unless you told me something about the size of those shifts. Okay. Any other questions on that? See a few people left after we did the participation quiz here. Okay. Here's just another way of thinking about it. So you have like the shorthand. So this is just an increase or decrease in demand, the impacts it'll have on the equilibrium. And then here was the different four simultaneous change combinations that we had. So, I really only worked through one of these in class. I would suggest working through those practice problems, start working on the practice exam problems, maybe even create, think of some cases, try to draw out the graphs for every single one of these. Now, anytime I have like these arrows, this is going to mean like indeterminate, right? We can't say what's going to happen to price, right? Or we can't say what's going to happen to quantity here. Okay. It could possibly stay the same if they were the exact same size shifts. Okay. All right. So I'll go back to, where's it at? Something else. So we had supply. There we go. Back to slide 50. So one more thing I want to do in the last kind of 6 minutes of class here. We won't talk about shortage surpluses. We'll save that and start class on Monday with that and then jump into module 4. But in identifying equilibriums, I've kind of done it all visually. We can also use supply and demand curves. So I'm going to use this supply and demand curve. We're going to talk about the marginal benefits and costs that exist for different units. And we're going to see how can I use these equations to identify the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So here, I had my demand curve was price equal to 100 minus 5Q. Supply was price equal to 20 plus 15Q. What's the marginal benefit of the fifth unit? What's the marginal cost of the third? And then we want to know what is the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So how could I find the marginal benefit of the fifth unit? Well, we said demand represents that price represents the marginal benefits. So all I would do is plug in my quantity I'm interested in, which was 5. So here my marginal benefit of the 5th unit would be what? 100 minus 5 times 5, or $75. Okay. The marginal cost of the 3rd, well, remember we said supply, that price represents marginal costs. So all that would mean is plugging in that quantity you want to find the marginal cost of into your supply curve. So here we would have what? 20 plus 15 times 3. So it's going to be what? 30, 45 plus 20. So this should be 65. Okay. Now, if I'm thinking about visually here, when I'm looking for the equilibrium, we said we're looking for the point where supply is equal to demand. Okay. Well, essentially, I'm looking for the price where the supply curve is equal to my demand curve. Well, if I have equations for both of those, all I'm really saying is take supply, set it equal to demand. So here's my supply equation. Here's my demand equation. Now it's just a little bit of algebra. Right? So I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides. Right? I'm left with 80 here. I'm going to add 5q to both sides. So now I've got 20q is equal to 80. Divide both sides by 20. And I've got that the equilibrium quantity is equal to what? 4. I've done the math here correctly. Okay. So that equilibrium quantity, when you set your supply and demand curves equal to each other, you will first find that equilibrium quantity. If I then ask you to find the corresponding equilibrium price, if you've done it correctly, if you've done the math correctly, hopefully you can plug this into either your supply or demand equations and come up with the same price. So that's what I'm going to try to do. All right. So if I take my initial supply equation, price was equal to 20 plus 15 times Q. My equilibrium quantity was 4. So I go ahead and do this math. I get a price of what? 80. I'm doing the math in my head correct there. Okay. And then if I plug it back into my demand equation, well, there my demand equation was 100 minus 5Q. So if I plug my quantity of 4 back into my demand equation, what do I end up with here? Also a price of 80. Okay. If I ever, I only have to use one of them, or I only have to plug it back into one. If I want to like check myself, if I plug it into either one, I should be coming up with the same value. If I'm not, I made a math error somewhere. Okay. I need to go back, set that supply and demand equation equal to each other, then take that equilibrium quantity, plug it into either one to find my corresponding equilibrium price. So if I ever ask you to find the equilibrium price and quantity, when I'm just giving you equations, kind of the steps would be set your supply and demand equations equal to each other. Right? You're then going to kind of do some algebra to solve for that equilibrium quantity. Once you have that equilibrium quantity, you're then going to plug that equilibrium quantity into either your supply or demand equation. And then, right, now you have all the values you can solve for that equilibrium price. Okay. Any questions on this idea here? Okay. So that module 3 quiz, just so you can kind of get started on it early if you do want to kind of work on it this weekend or before, I will have it set so that I take away any of the shortage surplus questions that are on there. So I'll kind of get that altered before I publish it here once I get back to my office. So it'll still have the same due date, everything. I'll only expect that you know what we covered today, which is everything up through kind of solving for equilibrium, simultaneous shifts, anything with shortages or surpluses and those practice problems, those will be expected for the exam, but not for this module 3 quiz. Right? We'll finish up, we'll kind of revisit this on Monday, finish up surpluses and shortages, then start module 4, and then have plenty of time between Monday and Tuesday, even covering a little bit of module 3 on Monday to cover all the module 4 material. Okay. Any other questions here before I end the recording?